edition of the Mogcast. I might say a special pre-lockdown edition. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, and I'm, of course, once again in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning.
Good morning.
Let me start with a rather specific question. Recently, the Chancellor was asked by the chairman of the Treasury Select Committee in the House about the economic analysis of the effects of the virus that the Treasury Chief Economist is conducting. Are you hoping that's published soon?
I think that a number of economists will look at the effect of the virus, and the Treasury's Chief Economist will be one of them, as will the very distinguished Chief Economist of the Bank of England, Mr. Haldane, and that political leaders will need to look at these various estimates and consider what long-term response is needed to essentially a one-off crisis. And I think there's a very important background to all that the Treasury has done to understand, which is that what has happened is an effort has been made to maintain the structures of the economy. That is to say that businesses that were solvent on the 1st of March, to try and keep as many of those as possible solvent when the pandemic is no longer affecting economic activity, whenever that will be. And if that were to be achieved, then the extra expenditure is very much exceptional one-off expenditure, which will not be continuing. And you will find that the latent demand that has been held back because of the steps taken to stop the pandemic re-emerges, and if the supply is still there and hasn't been destroyed in the process of the pandemic, then you get back to economic equilibrium quite quickly. So I think there will be many studies. They should all be looked at, but ultimately with economics, political leaders have to make decisions.
And this summer, the Department of Health published a study of excess deaths and mortality in relation to COVID. Are you also hoping that that's updated soon?
Look, I think with information relating to excess deaths and COVID, it will take a long time before there is a completely clear picture of all the effects as to what is strictly related to COVID, what other effects there have been, what the consequences of actions have been. I don't think that'll be something that we will have a full understanding of quickly. I think it's a long-term project to see what the full consequences are of the disease, of the response to the disease, and of where you have saved lives and where lives have been lost. I think that will all take time, and we will need to understand it. It becomes very important to understand it properly because other pandemics will occur, and we will need to work out what the response should be in future. And this is very interesting because you and I often discuss political history. We're both very interested in it. We both think there are enormous lessons for governments as to what happened in the past and how people dealt with things. The issue with the pandemic has been that, as far as I'm aware, there is no historic parallel that you can look at where the level of sophistication of treatment has been available, the level of central direction of the economy has been possible. Yes, you can look at the Spanish flu, but the ability of the government to deal with disease at that point was much less. Quite interesting why it was called the Spanish flu, which, according to what I read, was because Spain didn't have censorship when it started, whereas the UK, France and Germany did. And therefore, although we had quite high levels as it was still in the war, we wouldn't tell anybody because we didn't want to cause despair. And the Spanish allowed everybody to know, and therefore it was assumed to be a Spanish problem, not a problem elsewhere. And so that's the closest comparison, but that's a long time ago and very, very different in terms of what governments could do. When you go back to diseases in the 19th century, again, the ability of government to act and the medical situation was completely different. And so I think what our descendants will need to do is to look at and understand this in its historical context so that they can make decisions when things like this happen in future.
Let me just take you back, rather forward, from the Spanish flu to the Department of Health study. You said quite rightly we won't know all the factors for a while, but did manage to produce an interim study in the summer, did they not?
Well, I refer to what I said, that I think you've got to be much more patient. There's always a demand to know things very quickly, but we won't know things very quickly. We will not know long-term consequences, long-term health consequences. What's happened with mistreatments? What's the numbers there? What effect has that had? Have those mistreatments been made up very quickly? Are they not made up? It will take a long time to have really useful information. I think carts and horses need to be put in the right order.
By that same token, we can't possibly know, because the information is so obscure, whether or not the projections of growth in the disease and growth in debt are right, can we? All we can know at the moment is what the trend has been until now over the last few weeks.
You only know the trends that have actually happened, because a trend is changed by changes in behaviour when you establish the trend. You know this. There's the statistical law that as soon as you start looking at a statistic, it changes the behaviour of the statistic, and that was true with the monetary aggregates in the 1980s, and became a very disruptive influence on the medium-term financial strategy. And there is a named law about this, and I can't remember it. But you're much cleverer than I am, so you will have it at the tip of your tongue.
I'm not, though I know originally this is meant to be a phenomenon in studying particles in physics.
Well, I told you were cleverer than I am.
Yeah, but I don't know the name, do I? So I'm not.
But you're better informed than I am. And that's, of course, part of any projection on a trend, that as soon as you follow a trend, you affect the trend. So the point you're making is a valid one. And therefore, what is the job of politicians generally, but the Prime Minister in particular? The job of the Prime Minister is to listen to people he thinks are very well informed, are bringing their best, most impartial knowledge to bear on the situation, and are saying to him what they think may happen in a variety of circumstances, and then it is for him to make judgments. And I think that's what's been happening, and I think the people who have been advising him have been doing so with the greatest integrity and knowledge.
The reason I'm asking these questions, obviously, is that your colleagues have got to vote on Wednesday evening, and some of them are saying we know what the trend recently has been in terms of cases and hospitalisations and deaths. We don't know what will happen. We do know that the government has promised this economic analysis, but we haven't seen it yet. We do know the Department of Health has produced some health analysis. We would like to know what the government believes the full effect of the virus and the lockdown and the restrictions have been so far on lives and livelihoods, or at least information approximating the best they can do of what they know before we vote. Because otherwise, how can we possibly make the calculation of what course is now best to follow?
Well, I think that's the job of politicians, and Kissinger has done a lot of work on this and written about this, about how politicians have to make decisions on the information that is available, and by the time they've got perfect information, it's too late to make the decision. This is the long-standing historic problem with political decision-making, is that you never have all the information you need until making the decision is irrelevant.
I think some of them would say it's not perfect information, it's more information, and it's information that the Treasury has indicated that it would provide.
There's lots of information that is available, and there are any number of economic forecasts and predictions around, and historically the Treasury's record of economic forecasting is one that is perfectly respectable, but it's not infallible.
All right, we had a run around that particular course. I'm sure the subject will come back. Do you think, in retrospect, it was wise for the Conservative Party to take to social media a fortnight or so ago and berate Keir Starmer for suggesting a fire-break lockdown, which in the end is exactly what the government's now come round to?
I think that a Conservative government is very reluctant to have a lockdown is a thoroughly good thing, and that a socialist wants to lock you down at the first opportunity is not in the least surprising. There's a difference between our two parties, and I think we should be very reassured that the Prime Minister has come to this decision reluctantly when it is necessary, rather than thinking that let's take control of people's lives as quickly as possible. I think this is the right way to behave, fully support what the Prime Minister is doing and his approach to it, and to take decisions on the basis of the available information rather than speculatively when you are having a significant effect on people's lives and interference in their ancient liberties, let alone the long-term economic consequences.
I'm not saying he shouldn't be reluctant to do it, and nor am I saying he shouldn't do it, but it will be said, look, some of the scientific advisors were saying a fortnight ago that the three-tiered scheme wouldn't produce sufficient results and that a lockdown would be needed. And hey-ho, now we have one.
Some of the scientific advice has been saying we should have remained locked down the whole time. The job of politicians is to listen to the different voices and to make decisions. But the politicians have to balance the liberty that is being taken away against the scientific advice that is being given. And there is a high value on the liberty of the British people that should not be taken away lightly. And it is typical. I mean, this is absolutely at the heart of the philosophical difference between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. The Socialists always want to take control of people's lives. It's what they're there for. We don't want to do that. We do it reluctantly when it turns out to be absolutely necessary. And I think that's the right approach to have taken.
Is it possible that the lockdown will have to be extended beyond December the 2nd?
The motion before the House will be to the 2nd of December, and that will be the lockdown. What happens then is that the tier system is still there, and that will be the default position.
That's what the motion says, but it's not impossible the government might bring forward another motion to extend the lockdown beyond December the 2nd.
All sorts of things are not impossible, but I'm saying what the motion says, and the Prime Minister has been very clear in how he has phrased himself.
I just thought we'd have some clarity on the point. The motion may not necessarily be the last word.
Motions in Parliament are effective for the period of the life of the motion. Of course, that's obviously true. But it would have to come back to Parliament. That's really important because Parliament will be scrutinising all of this and people will be expressing their views and there will be judgments onto what has been the effect and nothing happens without there being a parliamentary majority for it, and that is democratic consent. I think this is, we've discussed this before in our earlier modcasts. What has been going on is not a draconian government ordering people's lives. It is a public and popular consent to restrictions in response to a disease. And everything that has happened has maintained public consent. There may be people who say you should have done X or Y or Z slightly differently, but the broad public consent is very, very strong. And I think that's important because it is why it hasn't been necessary in this country to have the sort of overzealous enforcement that there's been in some continental countries. It's why most of the restrictions have been broadly followed. And that's something I think very important and special about our country.
One person who's clearly concerned about the civil liberties aspect of all this is the chairman of the 1922 committee. We were talking previously about history. Who was the last chairman of the 1922 committee to be at loggerheads with the government, in effect, over a major policy issue like this?
It's an interesting question, and chairmen of the 1922 committee have taken different approaches. I'm not sure Sir Edward Buchan was always completely in sympathy with Margaret Thatcher.
Can we remember, we love these historical explorations. I can't remember Edward Buchan publicly falling out with a Conservative leader policy in this way.
No,
though, of course, Buchan did fall out very badly with Edward Heath.
He did indeed, and was instrumental in Edward Heath's period of leadership coming to an end. And at one point, of course, thought he'd get the leadership himself. I knew Sir Edward a little.
Somerset MP.
Somerset MP, indeed. I even stayed at his house in Somerset when I was very little, and he had a boxer dog that bit through my armband. and therefore my armband was useless because it was punctured, which gives you an idea of how little I was at the time. So I knew Sir Edward for quite a long time. He was a really very remarkable man, had some amazing political gifts, enormous charm, and therefore wasn't the sort of person who would oppose directly. He would oppose deftly. And I think there were quite a number of occasions when he was not in sympathy with what Margaret Thatcher was doing and opposed deftly. We live in a different age where things are done much more publicly. So I think Sir Edward, who are the next ones? Cranley Onslow. I don't think he was ever in open opposition. Does it then go to Archie, or was there somebody between Cranley and Archie?
Marcus Fox before Cranley Onslow.
Of course. And Marcus Fox was not entirely sympathetic to John Major.
Then Archie Hamilton.
Then Archie, then Michael Spicer, and then Graham. There's no one between Michael and Graham, is there?
Do we happen to know that it was true that Sir Edward, when asked what the time was by colleagues, would reply, "What time would you like it to be?"
It absolutely wouldn't surprise me. What he definitely did was he would go around his constituency saying to everybody, everyone tells me you're doing a wonderful job, which is the most flattering thing you can say, and try it on people. I did this with a fellow MP who I won't name, but also has a Somerset connection, and knew Sir Edward. And we wandered from Portcullis House across, and this fellow MP said to everyone we met, "Everyone tells me you're doing a wonderful job," and people loved it. I mean, it's great. You've got to have some courage to do it, which I lack, but as a political trick, it's a very good one.
On a more sober point, where people won't necessarily say the government's done a wonderful job, this is very much a layman's question, but some people will say, hang on a sec, the NHS was the subject of special protection from the government in the spring. Protect the NHS, save lives. How have we got ourselves in the position where we're being told that it's apparently in danger of being overwhelmed this winter when we've had all this time to prepare?
I think that is not only a fair question to ask, but is the question that I would be asking if I were in your shoes. And I think the answer is, first of all, there are always winter pressures, and that happens every year just in the natural cycle of events. There's also worth remembering that in March and April, most other NHS activities were suspended to create capacity entirely for COVID, and the aim is now not to do that, but to continue with all the other treatments. And anyone listening to this who has an illness and feels that they need to go and see their doctor must do so. The NHS is there and open, and many people haven't been going for services at the NHS, and they ought to be encouraged to do so. There is extra capacity with the Nightingale hospitals, but the estimates were that even with this extra capacity, it would be more than winter plus COVID would be able to cope with. So I think absolutely the arrangements were made, the extra beds were provided. There are limitations on the number of staff who are available, and that's just something you can't change in 6 months. You can build a few more beds, or put a few more beds in. I don't suppose you build beds, do you? Manufacture beds. But you can open a few more beds, but you can't necessarily get the staff. So I think the preparations have been made, the capacity has been increased, but the advice the Prime Minister was receiving was that even with all this additional capacity, it would be more than the NHS could cope with.
I've been asking you about this lockdown as though it were identical to the one in the spring, but of course it isn't. One of the differences is that people are being encouraged to go to work if they can't work from home, and that the schools will stay open. I mean, on this crucial point, what confidence can we have that they will, with the National Education Union poised literally to strike?
Looking at it from a parliamentary perspective, in April we moved to a completely virtual parliament, or almost completely virtual parliament. We will not be doing that. Parliament will be remaining open. And I think this is an important part of leadership by Parliament for the country, that we are showing that essential services need to continue. And I think schools are essential, and I think Parliament is essential. Government needs to be held to account, democracy requires that these decisions are scrutinised and that constituents are represented. And as Parliament is essential, so I think ensuring the life chances of our children is absolutely essential. And I think it would be cruel of the teaching union to strike, because the people this will hit will be the most vulnerable in society, the least able to look after themselves. We've already seen that people from more affluent backgrounds, their children continue to get a reasonable education during the summer months, and that was less true for those who are most deprived. And so I think that the unions must ponder carefully what they are doing to the least well-off in our society if they go on strike.
I mean, talking of events that go on and on, the argument over free school meals and feeding poorer children is set to go on and on, isn't it? Because the government's not produced a new move to close it down, which is what governments often do in these circumstances. The government's relying on the record of actions it's already taken, which is considerable, in order to conduct the debate. But we can look forward to this carrying on, can we not, all the way through Christmas into the Christmas holidays, while the government is trying to wrestle with managing the lockdown?
I think, first of all, one needs to understand what happened with free school meals over the lockdown. That children who were going into school were getting a hot meal in school, and that was replaced with a voucher during the school time and then into the holidays. They weren't actually getting a hot meal provided to them by the government. I think it's important to understand that the free school meals were changed into a voucher. But by and large, our welfare system is not a voucher-based system. It's a cash-based system, allowing people in receipt of benefits to make decisions for themselves rather than having vouchers. And extra money has been put into that. So the universal credit has been increased by £1,000 a year, so £20 a week. £95 billion a year is spent on non-retirement welfare support. So a great deal is already in place. And it is crucially important. I said this in the chamber of the House, and I know that quoting oneself is not something to be encouraged, but I think it's true and it's worth emphasising. Every politician in this country wants to look after the least well-off children. There is not a single member of the House of Commons, or indeed of the House of Lords, who doesn't wish to do this. It is merely a question of what is the best way to do it. And the question is, should the education system be a part of the welfare system, or should welfare be there to ensure that children are looked after? The government decision is that the welfare system should do this, and that seems to me to be the right approach. So you quite rightly say, no rabbit has been brought out of the hat. Sometimes if you're following the right policy, you shouldn't bring rabbits out of the hat.
So there won't be a rabbit in this case?
Well, I don't know that there's a hat.
If there is a hat, since there seems to be a hat, are you sure there won't be a rabbit? There's a reason for asking this other than quibbling with words and enjoying ourselves, which is, it is a complaint of some of the colleagues. It's what I call the forestry sell-offs phenomena, whereby backbenchers feel they go out to bat for the government, they commit to a particular course of action, over the top they go, in this familiar Tory terminology, they look round and their officers aren't there because they've changed the policy.
I remember this only too well with forestry, because I was fairly newly elected MP at that time, and I think I must have sent off 300 letters saying what a marvellous policy I thought it was, and then suddenly it was no longer a marvellous policy. There's a very interesting dilemma for all politicians and all of us in life, isn't there? That sometimes you do things and you come to the conclusion that they were a mistake and you have to change them. On the other hand, sometimes you do things and you think they're right and you've got to stick with them. Governments mustn't be so inflexible that they never change their minds, because otherwise they just make bigger mistakes. They just dig in. I suppose the classic example is the US in Vietnam, that it dug in and it became bigger and bigger mistake, and that actually if they had cut earlier it would have been better for the US's reputation over the last 50 years, etc., etc. On the other hand, some governments respond much too quickly to 3 people in a focus group and change policy too easily, and that leads to disorganisation in governments. It's all about getting the balance right, and it won't surprise you to know I think this government has got the balance right and has stuck to policies where that is the right thing to do, but hasn't been so stubborn as it hasn't recognised when situations have changed and evolved.
Of course, you can't rule out a rabbit coming out of a hat in this instance. I'm not even going to ask you the question because it's not a trick question. You literally can't. So let's finish with something completely different. Do you think we're going to get a clear election result out of the United States this week?
Yes, I do. It's one of those things that always seems to happen with US elections, that you go through the process every single time. First of all, the primaries won't be clear. It's going to be decided at the convention. Do you remember when it was last decided at the convention? So I can't answer my own question. But January every year, one or other party is not going to have a clear result. It's going to be a really exciting convention because at last it's going to be decided. And then, since George Bush Jr.'s result, it's going to be hanging chads and nobody's going to know, and it's going to take days and weeks, and all the postal ballots aren't going to be counted, and it'll come down to the House of Representatives. I think I've heard that it was going to come down to the House of Representatives. In every US election where I've had any knowledge of what the House of Representatives was, which is probably second Reagan. I think I was only 11 in 1980. So by the time I was 15, I probably knew that the House of Representatives had the final say if the convention couldn't decide, didn't have a majority. It hasn't happened in a very, very long time, and I guess that either candidate will in fact accept the result, and that may be my boldest prediction, but I think American democracy is wonderfully robust. But then I think the 2 greatest constitutions in the world are our Constitution and the American Constitution, and that they are both in their way very beautiful instruments. Well,
let's see what happens next. In the meantime, Jacob, thank you very much for another fascinating Mogcast. Do you want to ask yourself a question?
Yes, because you normally ask me what I'm reading. And I'm back to Woodhouse.
Not invariably, but tell us.
But I'm reading Pigs Have Wings. And for anybody, any of the listeners who feel that in these difficult circumstances they need a little cheering up, may I strongly recommend Pigs Have Wings. It is so funny that I sit at home laughing to myself.
Pigs Have Wings turns up in a rather less cheerful context, doesn't it? It turns up in Kipling's The Gods of the Copybook Headings. They told us that pigs had wings.
Right. Well, P.G. Woodhouse, it's great fun.
Followed the gods of the market who promised these beautiful things. On which note, we will end. Thank you, as I say, for another very interesting Mogcast. On behalf of all our readers,
we will make America great again.